Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Marcus Alexander. He works as a scientist in the Human Nature Lab at the Yale Institute for Network Science. His research focuses on genomics of social networks, the evolution of human cooperation, and large-scale field interventions that improve and extend human life. Today we'll talk with Dr. Alexander about the Biome Biology and Social Networks in the Developing World project. Welcome, Dr. Alexander.
I'm excited to be here.
Let's start with an overview of the project you're working on. Tell us about it.
Well, for the past 2 years or so, the Human Nature Lab has been running a large public health intervention in Honduras. We are running a network targeting trial to improve infant and maternal health. And as a part of that, this project, which is led by Professor Nicholas Christakis, has consisted of mapping face-to-face social networks in a large sample of about 30,000 people across 176 villages.
Wow.
And our goal in that project is to deliver health education so to improve health outcomes. Now, the Microbiome Project really started when I moved here from Stanford, where I did my postdoc mostly in genomics. I brought to this project my interest in biology, my interest in genomics, and Professor Christakis had a large social network mapped with a lot of information on it and opportunities to study how health spreads through a human network. Okay. So this project, which I can't take all credit for, I have to say that it's really a brainchild of Nicholas Christakis, started by trying to understand what is the distribution of bacteria that colonize human bodies across a network of social interactions.
Okay, let's talk about some terms you use. Social networks, what do you mean by that? And also genomics. Can you define that term as well for us?
Sure. So we take social networks to be actual real social interactions. So I'm not talking about Facebook. Okay. We're talking here about villages in a remote part of the world. People live there at most $1 or $2 a day. They're very isolated. And what we've done is we went into the field and we developed an app called Trellis, which is a map for photographic mapping of social networks. So we went into these villages, and when I say we, I mean there's a team of about 100 people working in the field. And we map social networks by first taking pictures of everybody. So there's a huge, basically Facebook, so to speak, of this part of the world. And then we went to people and asked them what we call name generator question. So I may ask you, for example, who do you go to discuss important matters with?
Okay.
And you will give me a number of names. I will type in the names, and you will point to the picture of the person. Okay. So with a number of these name generators, we were able to construct what is now the largest mapped social network ever done by any research group. Okay. So that's what we mean by social network. Okay. What we mean by the genomic, you asked, well, genome is basically the bag of genes that each of us carries with us that give us instructions on our body instructions on how to function. Okay. So when we say human genome, we really mean studying the genetic code of the entire population.
Okay, and why Honduras?
Well, Honduras, as I said, is a very remote and poor area of the world. One of the goals of the Human Nature Lab at Yale has been not only to understand how humans interact, but also to use the knowledge that we uncover to design better health interventions that can actually change people's lives. So the core project in Honduras is really trying to make the delivery of health education to women who may be pregnant or may become pregnant in a very efficient way by targeting key people in the social network and therefore helping the intervention spread exponentially through the entire region.
Okay, and how long has this study been going on?
So the Microbiome Project is, so that's a very kind of exciting new work. This whole study has been funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and by the International Development Bank. The new study funded by the Nomis Foundation consists of setting up an entire set of procedures to collect biological specimens from these subjects. Okay. So this project has started about a year ago, and what we've done, we've set up a cold chain of procedures and equipment that is required to pick up a sample, for example, a stool sample in a remote village in Honduras, freeze it in liquid nitrogen, transport it to our local office, then prepare it for shipping, bring it to the Yale lab, and at Yale lab we share it with our collaborators. Ilana Brito is a microbiologist at Cornell. She's one of our main collaborators. So we then share these biological samples and analyze the DNA that's contained in it.
Okay, and what are you hoping to find?
Well, we have some hints already that the microbiome in the developing world is very different than the microbiome in, that we carry here.
And why is that?
For example, we're exposed to different pathogens, but more importantly, we have different hygiene practices. We're exposed to new antibiotics. So there's some hints that the microbiome of this developing area will be much more diverse. They will have many more genes that are specialized to do different things adapted to the people who live there. For example, diet is one of them. And one exciting part about that is that as our societies develop and become more industrialized, a lot of biological diversity that exists in this bacterial population may be lost. So a number of genes, a number of species may disappear from the face of Earth. Doing studies like this in the developing world enable us to get a better glimpse at the full genetic diversity. And needless to say, if we understand the bacteria that people carry, we will understand more about the diseases that they are exposed to and how these diseases may spread from person to person.
Let's talk a little bit more about that in terms of some of the things that were talked about in the study, in terms of obesity, for instance, and diabetes, things that typically you cannot catch from another person. But what you're saying is through these things in our bodies that is possible. Just expound on that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. That's quite a controversial statement. But
yes, it is.
But it was Nicholas's work, the work of the Human Nature Lab, maybe now 10 years ago, that first established in a network of people in Framingham, in the city of Framingham, that obesity clusters in a social network. That if my friend's friend gains a few pounds, I become more likely to gain a few pounds. So far, what we've thought of is this process being a social process. We affect how each of us behaves. We affect each other's norms. But what our microbiome study asks is whether there could be also biological mechanism behind it.
Right, and that's fascinating.
Exactly. One of the big discoveries that was made at MIT in Eric Alm's lab, and Professor Brito has worked on this, is this concept of mobile genes. So it turns out that human body has about 20,000 protein coding genes. Bacteria have millions. And not only that, but their genes can jump from strain to strain. So there are these little mobile genes that can actually move quite fast through the bacterial population. They may be antibiotic resistance genes, but they also could be genes that increase risk of diabetes for some people, or risk of autism, or risk of obesity and other metabolic disorders. So this is really an uncharted territory. We really feel a little bit like explorers going into an unknown land, so to speak, of microbiome and trying to map these new bacterial strains and their genes.
So what would have to happen in order for some research to actually indicate that one can get diabetes from another person?
I think we're definitely not there yet.
Okay.
But the first step, I would say, is to understand what species and what genes exist in this population.
Okay.
To give you a very kind of example connected to diabetes, carbohydrates are very important in how we process them. Well, it turns out that in different parts of the world, people get their carbohydrates from very different sources.
Right.
So tortilla chips may be the main source of carbohydrates in this area in Honduras. Wheat and bread may be here. Well, it turns out that bacteria have evolved genes and have populated our gut, our human gut, in a way to adapt to processing those particular carbohydrates. So anything that may go wrong in that symbiotic relationship between the bacteria and how our body works has the potential to affect a risk of diabetes and other diseases.
Right, right. So ultimately, how long will this new study go on for?
We're hoping that this will be a multi-year study. One of the things that we also hope to do is remap all the social networks again and see how they change, and whether a change in social relationship is reflected in a change in the type of bacteria or genes that we carry in our gut. Okay,
and why is it so important that this is studied?
So I mentioned the idea of biodiversity. We really understand very little about the role bacteria play in health. Recent evidence you mentioned on the diabetes, but there is also recent evidence that a number of mental health disorders, for example, depression, ADHD, autism, anxiety, may be linked to the way our gut interacts with the microbiome. So as I said, it's a very unexplored area. When we take this to the setting of the developing world, there's an added imperative to actually do something and help people in the region. So one of the great pleasures of working in the Human Nature Lab has been our ability to directly affect the lives of the people in the field. So for example, the way we collect these specimens is we have planned to have little village clinics set up in these remote villages, where villagers can come and can get screened for through a basic physical and give their samples. We give them back results of some of their studies, and we provide free deworming medication, for example, for those affected. So we think that there's this partnership that we can have between subjects that contribute to our knowledge of basic science, and on our part, us contributing to their everyday health.
Sure. All right, well, this is fascinating, and I'm sure it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of this study. So thank you very much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you very much.
For more information about Dr. Alexander and his research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.